Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Mike from MOBOX Graphics, and we're back with another video, this time covering a wide range of different things. The outcome doesn't really matter, but basically the steps to get us there, I think you're going to learn a lot. For one, we're going to learn how to loop wiggle expressions, which I was like blown away when I found the expression by Dan. We're going to be looking at using indexes to kind of simplify our workflow, and we're going to be using some of the techniques that I've learned by watching Erica Anderson's Instagram posts and her kind of daily creative to get a kind of vintage look. So anyways, let's just go ahead and jump into After Effects here and see what we have. Let's go ahead and just start and create a new composition, new. And I'm going to set 1000 by 1000, 5 seconds. I think that that's fine. So I'm just going to start by creating kind of a circle. And I don't want to stroke, but I'm going to just kind of put this somewhere in the center of the composition. And I'm just going to scale it down maybe 50%. It's a little large. And that looks pretty cool. So I'm also going to create a layer new null object. And I'm going to add a few slider controllers. So I'm just in my effects and presets panel, I'm just going to search for slider and I'm going to drag a few over. So I'm going to need 4 of them and I'm just going to rename them. You don't really need to do this. To be honest, you could just put these numbers in manually later, but I like adding them onto the sliders because if I ever want to reuse this composition later, it might be longer, it might be shorter, and I could adjust kind of some of these effectors, I guess I would call them, and I could change the way the animation looks. So I like to put them in this slider. On this object, I'm going to hit P on the keyboard, and I'm going to hold Alt and hit the stopwatch. Now I'm going to write quite a long expression here, but I'm going to need these sliders, so I'm just going to open these up. So I'm going to type in F equals, and I'm going to drag it to the slider. So frequency, A equals amplitude. I'm basically just porting in these values. Okay, now T equals time. I'm going to use the percent bracket, loop time, wiggle 1 equals wiggle. F comma A comma 1 comma 1 comma T. So I'm basically utilizing my frequency and amplitude in a wiggle. And I'm actually going to duplicate this wiggle. Control Shift, Control Paste. I'm going to name this wiggle 2. And I'm going to say time minus loop time. Okay, now I'm just going to do my kind of expression where I bring these two values together. So I'm going to go ease time, comma 0, comma wiggle 1, comma wiggle 2. And now on this controller layer, I'm just going to change my frequency, amplitude, time, and index. My index value, I'll show you what that means in a second, but for frequency, I'm going to put 0.5. For amplitude, I'm going to do 600. For time, I'm going to do 5. Now let's see, it looks like I still have an issue here. Let's see, what could it be? 5 arguments, 1, 2, 3, 4. What happens if I just do comma? I'm gonna do comma 0, comma, oh, that's what I forgot, loop, time, comma wiggle. So now you could see what happens when I decrease the amplitude. This thing is going to have a much smaller distance it travels. And when I increase the frequency, it just increases the speed at which it moves. And then time is how this whole thing is looping. So basically, I'm limiting it at time, and this is looping all in 5 seconds. That's what this time parameter equals, T and loop time. So all of this I got from Dan, except for he used linear and I used ease. I don't know if there's much of a difference between ease and linear in this case. There might be, but I think that this looks pretty good. So I tested it with ease and I thought it looked a little bit better. So maybe I'm just kind of crazy. So now that this is set up, I could basically just duplicate this layer, I don't know, like 20 times. And now I'll basically have a lot of these dots kind of moving around. Now, to get the line in between the dots, I'm going to use something called beam. So layer new solid, and I'm just going to add kind of a red solid, and I'm going to move it to the bottom, and I'm going to search for an effect called beam. Drag that down, set the length to 100, set the starting thickness to 3, the ending thickness 3, and set these both to white, and reduce the softness down to 0. So I'm going to add some expressions for the start time and the end time. So holding Alt, I'm going to hit just both of those stopwatches, and I'm going to add an expression. Okay, so in this first one, I'm going to just use kind of this pick whip to pull the expression in, but inside this parentheses, I want to change this to index minus the controller's index. So basically what I'm saying is, look at this composition, look at the layer that corresponds to this index number, which this index number is 22 here. That's basically layer number 22, minus this controller. So now this controller I could put in as 20, and now it pulls up to this layer. I'm going to just copy that expression and paste it down here, except for I'm going to look at the controller and I'm going to plus 1. So now that pulled the endpoint of this to the second layer down. So, okay, I'm just going to duplicate this layer now, rename the top one to A, rename the bottom one to B, and I'm going to make this a little bit more interesting by, instead of saying +1 on this one, do it +2. Now, if I could just take both of these layers, Control D, I'm just going to keep duplicating these layers and dragging them down until I have them all touching a circle. So you can see that there's actually one grabbing the center, and the reason being is that I have one too many layers. So if I just delete the last layer, it should go away. If yours doesn't go away, just keep deleting layers from the bottom and eventually it will disappear. So basically the reason why I split these up into 2 is I've made it so some of these layers or some of these dots have 3 connectors to them, others have only 1, and some have 2. So I thought this was a really interesting way to kind of make it look a little bit more dynamic and less like just a giant mesh. This is really just a long way about doing this, but I don't know, I thought it looked pretty cool. So now that all the beams are in place and all the expressions are in place, we are able to now pre-compose all of this. Control-Shift-C. Now, I'm going to pre-compose this again, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. Actually, I'll just explain to you now. One thing I was trying before was kind of duplicating this a few times, offsetting it by about 1 frame, and then reducing the transparency by it's like 10, 5, 2, or 1 is probably fine. But you can see with that it doesn't really add too much, but later on with the effects that I add onto it, it actually does do a lot. So I might come back here and turn those off, but we'll just kind of let it roll for right now. Okay, so now that I have this, I'm going to start adding those like vintagey looking effects, but I'm going to need a black solid background. I'm also going to need an adjustment layer, and I'm going to grab a logo. This isn't a very cool logo. So, okay, and I'm going to now create another adjustment layer and a null object. So I have all my layers here, and I'm going to start adding effects to them. So onto my bottom layer, so I'm going to just name this one like lines. I got my lines, my logos, and my 2 adjustment layers. I'm going to add CC lens. I just love this effect. It really makes things look so much more interesting. I'm just gonna drag this out. I don't want it to be like too much of a lens, but I definitely want things to, like, when they approach the side, they seem to kind of wrap around a little bit. I want there to be some curve. I believe it's like 150 maybe. Maybe 175. And I'm also going to add on here a wave warp. And this is where I'm gonna get my like distortion. So I'm gonna change this to smooth noise. And that looks a little too crazy. So I'm gonna maybe decrease this down to maybe like 4. But then increase the width to maybe like 65. So it's kind of very almost unnoticeable in motion. But I thought that looked pretty cool. And I'm gonna maybe get rid of the speed because maybe I don't want the waves to be moving. It's very difficult to loop stuff like this, so I don't want any real movement added. Now I'm going to add a noise to my first adjustment layer. And I'm gonna set this to maybe like 30. So I'm gonna like give it a ton of noise and a tint. So I use tint a lot. Basically, it allows you to map the black and whites to different values. So I'm gonna maybe map the white to like a turquoise and then the black to like a deep green. So you can see those additional duplications are really adding a lot when before you can barely even see them. Like you can barely see them here, but here they're very visible. So I don't know how I feel about them yet. To get that VHS or CRT look, I'm gonna add a find edges also to the adjustment layer, which find edges on its own looks pretty cool. But I'm just going to kind of increase this value. And you can see it almost doesn't add anything to it. Let's see, maybe I'm gonna set this to like 85. So it almost doesn't do anything for you, but bring that dark, maybe a little bit darker. But it does kind of make these edges a little bit darker, which is a kind of an effect of those that old type of content. Let's see, now I'm just gonna add a vignette. If I could spell vignette. And I'm gonna change this to something around like 190 and then maybe 50. So we're getting kind of that darker color back, which is nice. And maybe I add the vignette under the noise. No, definitely not. Okay, so on my logo now, I'm going to add, I think I'm going to change the color slightly. It's a little bit too white. I'm going to make it kind of like an off-white. So I'm gonna look for something called fill. Drag it onto my logo and make this like almost like a yellowish, like a beige color. And look for a drop shadow on here. So I'm gonna add 2 drop shadows. One that's a little bit wider and one that's a little bit shallower. And then I am going to add a Gaussian blur onto the top adjustment layer. And this is going to be super, super brief. This is going to be like 2. So it's just a slight blur, very slight blur. And then I'm going to add a noise. And this noise is going to be like 8. So not as much noise as we did before. Before we did around 30. We could probably even increase that, but I think that that looks pretty cool. And then the last thing I'm going to do, which I don't know how Erica Evanderson gets it to look so good, but I think one of the ways she does that is by kind of making the whole composition shift by about 1 pixel every frame. So that kind of gives it the effect that it's like a film product, because the film slides by the lens. So I'm going to parent the logo to the null object and the line background to the null object. And I'm going to hit P on the keyboard and add a wiggle expression by holding Alt and selecting the stopwatch. And I'm going to add a wiggle. And I'm going to set this to the same as my composition. So 23.98. So that's how I want 23.98 wiggles per second, right? That's how many frames I'm using. And I want it to shift by like maybe 1.5 pixels. And maybe 1.5 is even too much, maybe just 1. And I'm gonna add motion blur. That way that motion kind of gets a little bit more blurred out. And that's pretty much it. I'm actually pretty glad that I left those lines here. So anyways, guys, I hope you learned something new. I hope you learned how to make looped wiggles, because that's what we did in the very beginning. I'll link Dan's post down in the description. So we learned how to loop wiggles. We learned how to add kind of a vintagey look by shifting the composition by about 1 frame every second. We learned how to connect beams to dots via indexes, so you don't have to do it by hand. And we learned how to make a tutorial that lasts 3 times longer than it's required, because the person doesn't know how to do everything properly. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give this video a like, subscribe, check out other videos on this channel. And again, you could download this on our Patreon account. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching.